FBI, freeze! Get down on the ground!
A family vanishes without a trace. Local authorities find no leads to the identity of their abductors. When stolen weapons began to surface, investigators realized the perpetrators were part of a nationwide rampage of violence. They were dangerous men who would stop at nothing to escape justice.
Panic fam, I'm Hannah, and if it's 2 a.m., the lights are off and the popcorn is gone cold, you know, it's Panic TV time. Welcome. If you survived this, and this, congratulations, all right? Congratulations, but your luck runs out here.
When a family was murdered in Arkansas, it seemed like an isolated event. But soon the crime was revealed to be part of an ever-widening circle of violence that defined a new age of domestic terrorism. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. For the killers, the triple homicide in Arkansas was simply a means to an end. They made their way across the country, letting nothing stand between them and their twisted mission. And we would stop at nothing to prevent their rampage.
January 1996. Tilley, Arkansas, a small rural neighborhood, was home to William Mueller. Mueller was a gun enthusiast and self-employed electrician. His wife Nancy homeschooled their 8-year-old daughter Sarah. Returning from a day of work, the Muellers were confronted by 2 men in their home.
Get in here, don't move! You got him? Hands behind your back! Hands behind your back, ma'am, down!
They were dressed as FBI agents, but they were imposters. They were after the large supply of weapons and cash that Mueller had in his home. When the 52-year-old Mueller refused to cooperate, the intruders separated the family and tortured them. Nancy Mueller's mother, Eileen Branch, grew concerned when she hadn't heard from her daughter in 2 weeks. She turned to the sheriff for help.
I usually hear from her at least.
She explained that the family often traveled to gun shows, yet her daughter always called when they returned.
This is unusual.
Although the Muellers lived in a neighboring county, the sheriff knew the family and agreed to look into the matter. He checked with local authorities and talked to Mueller's neighbors. Though Sheriff Jay Winters found no trace of the family, people who knew them weren't concerned.
For the most part, there wasn't a lot of fear. Most people thought, you know, maybe they had just gone off somewhere and wanted to be on their own for a while.
On February 11th, a month after their disappearance, a farmer found the Muellers' Jeep concealed and abandoned off the highway, miles from their home. Detective Aaron Duval from the Pope County Sheriff's Office was sent to investigate.
It was approximately 20 miles north of Russellville, off the State Highway 7, hid behind a brush pile. I was called out that day, went up there, took pictures of the vehicle and the trailer.
Inside the Jeep, Duval found Nancy Mueller's purse. It held her wallet and ID. The trailer, used by Bill Mueller to transport munitions to gun shows, was empty. Several more months passed, and the Muellers were still missing. 40 miles from Tilly, an elderly couple enjoyed a day of fishing in a bayou near Russellville. While waiting for a fish to bite, the woman snagged her line. She pulled up an old tennis shoe. A leg bone jutted out of it. Horrified, she cut it loose and went for help. Within hours, search teams combed the bayou organized by Sheriff Winters. They used large metal hooks to drag the bottom. Divers swam the depths. By day's end, parts of a single body were recovered, a murder victim.
The torso had a rock attached to it. There was a lot of tape on it. The head had a bag of some type on it, duct tape around the head. Very disturbing to us because it was obvious, you know, that this was a different type of thing than we typically deal with. It was an obvious execution. It was just some cold-hearted people.
Investigators determined it was the body of a small female. They thought it might have been a 6-year-old girl who had been abducted several counties away the previous year. When the clothing and size didn't match her description, another possibility became apparent. It could have been Sarah Mueller. The next day, 2 more partial bodies were found. All 3 torsos had been weighed down with rocks, and each head was covered with a plastic bag secured with duct tape. Dental records, DNA, and clothing confirmed the identity of the bodies. They were William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and their daughter Sarah. The missing persons case was now a grisly triple homicide investigation.
It was bad for Bill and Nancy to have to die the way they did. But for a 7-year-old girl to die that way, to be wrapped with plastic, to be wrapped with duct tape, to have a 60-pound rock strapped to her body and thrown into a lake, there was no excuse.
During the autopsy, the coroner determined that the 3 had probably been in the water since January 11th, the last day they were seen. A later examination revealed several specks of blue paint stuck to the tape that bound the bodies. Investigators sent the paint specks to the FBI lab in Washington, D.C. for analysis. A forensic chemist determined that they were consistent with auto paint. The challenge was to match them to a specific make and model. Using infrared light, the examiner established the chemical composition of the paint. This chemical signature was fed into a computer database containing similar information from every auto make, model, and color dating back to 1934. The results gave the Arkansas investigators their first lead.
So we thought that the vehicle that the bodies were transported in possibly was blue. It was determined a particular blue color, metallic blue. The FBI even narrowed it down that it was a General Motors vehicle.
Investigators reasoned that they were looking for at least 2 perpetrators. One must have driven the blue car with the bodies in it to the water, while the other followed in the Mueller's Jeep. By the time they dumped the bodies, the Muellers were probably already dead, suffocated by the plastic bags. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms from Little Rock, Arkansas was called in. ATF agent Glenn Jordan headed the case.
Our jurisdiction lay in the fact that Mueller was a former federal firearms licensee, that his firearms were missing, and the fact that Mr. Mueller and his family had been murdered.
The ATF had a complete record of Mueller's gun inventory before he forfeited his federal license. With no reports of gun sales since then, agents figured the missing weapons had been stolen.
Our goal was to enter the serial numbers of those firearms into the National Crime Information Computer. In case those firearms turned up later, that would give us a lead to follow in the investigation.
Jordan was already familiar with Bill Mueller's name since the family had been the victims of a theft 1 year earlier. At the time of that robbery, Mueller reported $40,000 worth of merchandise stolen, including 5 firearms and ammunition. Since the Muellers had been victims of a robbery and homicide within the same year, agents believed that the family had been targeted by a group who used and sold stolen weapons, perhaps members of an anti-government militia.
Come on in, fellas.
Investigators returned to inspect the Muellers' belongings. After the family had disappeared, relatives had taken most of their valuable items. The landlord stored the remaining possessions in his garage. They found a Colt .45 gun case labeled with a serial number, but the gun was missing. They also found a picture of the family with some friends. The ATF entered the serial number of the Colt .45 into the NCIC, the National Crime Information Center. They got a hit. The handgun had been traced to a man named Travis Brake. He had been arrested 5 months earlier in Seattle, Washington for carrying a concealed weapon. Because the gun he was carrying was now linked to another crime, Brake was arrested again by the Seattle police, this time for possession of a stolen weapon. Jordan and Duval flew to Washington State to question him.
Mr. Brake was interviewed and advised the Seattle Police Department that he had purchased this handgun at a gun show in Seattle, Washington, and he described 2 individuals that he had purchased the firearm from, one in particularly that he remembered.
Investigators showed him the photograph found among the Mueller's possessions. Brake identified one of the men who sold him the gun.
That's him, right here.
His name was Keith Collins. Agents asked Bill and Nancy Mueller's friends if they had ever heard of him. Collins had once been close with the Muellers. They had attended gun shows together. Investigators discovered that Keith Collins' real name was Kirby Kehoe. The ATF learned that Kirby Kehoe had an extensive record for firearms violations. Kehoe was also actively involved in the white supremacist movement. Members of this growing faction are strongly anti-government, heavily armed, and considered dangerous. Kirby Kehoe became a prime suspect in the Mueller triple homicide. Investigators needed more evidence before they moved in for an arrest. Almost a year after the triple murder and robbery of Bill, Nancy, and Sarah Mueller, investigators were still hunting for the killers, believed to be militant white supremacists. In Sioux Falls, South Dakota, 11 months after the crime, a trooper noticed a blue Chevy Suburban parked in a handicapped space. He found a young couple sleeping inside. The man said his name was Sean Haynes. He and his pregnant girlfriend had pulled over to rest for a while. From the bumper stickers on his truck, the trooper believed he was a white supremacist. He asked Haynes if he was carrying any weapons. Haynes showed him 2 guns in the back of his vehicle. The trooper called in the serial numbers and discovered they had been stolen. One, an AR-15 rifle, had been taken from the Mueller's house in Arkansas. Haynes was arrested. Alerted that one of Mueller's guns had turned up in South Dakota, investigators from Arkansas went there to interview Haynes. Haynes revealed that he had traded another firearm for the AR-15 rifle at a Washington State motel 6 months earlier.
Can you explain how they got there?
The name of the man he swapped with was 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐅𝐁𝐈 𝐅𝐢𝐥𝐞𝐬's eldest son. Now 𝐓𝐡 was also connected to the Mueller murders. Investigators weren't through with Haynes, though. They took a paint sample from his blue Suburban. They determined that the sample did not match the paint found on the duct tape wrapped around the Muellers. Haynes had nothing more to offer. The investigation turned to 𝐓𝐡𝐞, but he was nowhere to be found. Several weeks later, Ohio State Highway Patrol Officer Harold Harker had a routine assignment: to catch speeders in the small town of Wilmington, not far from Cincinnati. While observing traffic, he noticed a blue Chevy Suburban going slower than the speed limit. Harker, a 25-year veteran who was now retired, recalled how he thought the people inside were acting strangely as they drove by.
As it approached, I saw it did not have a front license plate, and as it passed me, the driver didn't acknowledge my presence in any way, didn't look at the patrol car, just kept both hands on the wheel, fixed straight ahead. However, the passenger not only looked at me as he went by, he actually turned in the seat and looked out the rear window to watch me.
Harker knew that Washington State required vehicles to have license plates on both front and back. He called in the plate number and followed the Suburban while waiting for his dispatcher to come back with some information.
And they returned and told me that the plate apparently did match the vehicle, however it was expired. So at that point I made the determination that once we got into Wilmington where the berms were wider, I would initiate a traffic stop there.
Harker's car was equipped with a video camera mounted on the dashboard. A microphone was fastened to Harker's shirt. Harker asked the passenger and driver for ID. While talking to the men, Harker became more troubled. Neither had any ID. The driver was speaking in a very animated fashion, while the passenger looked straight ahead.
At this point, I was concerned enough with my safety and so on. I wanted to get the people away from the vehicle, and I wanted to, here again, get them separated, get the driver into my car so that I'm a little more in control of their actions.
Let's sit back here with me a second, sir.
The driver eventually followed Harker to his patrol car.
You say you borrowed the vehicle? You say you borrowed the vehicle?
It's actually what I'll tell you what the process is.
Okay.
When the officer tried to frisk him, the driver quickly stepped back and became defensive.
And he actually moved away from me and used the terminology, "I don't want to be violated like that." In 25 years of criminal patrol operations, I had never had anyone use that particular terminology. And that, coupled with the appearance of the two young men, the fact that they had close-cropped military-style haircuts, very clean cut, and the driver had a Marine Corps type cover, I felt comfortable that I was probably dealing with militia personnel at that point.
Across the highway, a fellow officer, Deputy Sheriff Robert Gates, saw Harker talking with the driver and turned around to assist him. This was a common practice since officers often worked alone in rural sections of the state.
His whole purpose is to monitor the entire situation. He doesn't get involved with answering questions, giving direction. That's my job. His job is purely to watch and observe.
The men told him they were looking for work on construction sites. Harker told the driver that if he or his passenger could not provide identification, their vehicle would be confiscated. The driver attempted to escape. As both officers tried to apprehend him, the passenger jumped from the vehicle and started firing. The passenger fled the scene while Harker tried to stop the driver. His arm became caught in the door, but he managed to free himself. The other suspect escaped into the woods. Gates pursued him. He feared an ambush among the dense trees, so he turned around. Harker, back at his car with a shot-out tire, called for help. Within moments, the rest of the Wilmington, Ohio Police Department was notified about the shootout. Officer Robert Martin heard the bulletin and then observed a Suburban in an electrical supply company parking lot. He called in his location as he went to investigate.
Army 10-6 with that suspect vehicle behind the building supply.
The Suburban's driver opened fire.
Ugh, I swear my neighbors think I'm probably getting murdered right now.
Another policeman arrived to assist him. The suspect had disappeared into the industrial area. He'd shot 32 rounds. One wounded a bystander. Back at the first shootout site, investigators were trying to piece together what happened and to learn the shooters' identities. Using metal detectors, they searched for shell casings. The entire area was meticulously photographed and all evidence collected. The small town of Wilmington had never seen anything like this. Police mobilized a manhunt for the two armed suspects. The search continued into the night. Reinforcements were brought in from neighboring counties. Police knew the suspects would resort to violence in order to escape. They had to find them before anyone was killed. The suspects in the shootout were still at large. The ATF and Ohio State Police examined the second gunfight location in the Chevy Suburban. The entire crime scene was processed for fingerprints in hopes of determining the shooter's identity. Inside the vehicle were assault rifles, thousands of rounds of ammunition, military supplies, and medical packs. Investigators traced the munitions through receipts supplied by the manufacturers. Much of the ammo and gun parts belonged to the murdered Arkansas gun dealer, William Mueller. The extent of the military supplies suggested the shooters were violent members of an anti-government group. Ohio investigators notified the FBI. FBI agent Bill Hargraves from the Cincinnati field office spearheaded the investigation.
The case became a domestic terrorism case, basically because of the items that were found in the Suburban They had numerous weapons, ammunition, law enforcement clothing and equipment, law enforcement identification.
Yes, this is Trooper Herman with Ohio State Police.
Ohio State troopers traced the Suburban's registration to a man named Jacob Settle from Spokane, Washington. On the day of the shootout, Settle told the trooper he was with friends in Washington State, more than 2,000 miles from Ohio. He also claimed that he had sold the vehicle to a man named 𝐓𝐴𝐴. It would take several days for authorities to corroborate Settle's story. Ohio State troopers compared a copy of Settle's driver's license photo against images of the fugitives caught on tape. The picture didn't match. The videotape was their best clue. Ohio State Police released the tape nationwide to try to find the shooters' identities. The shootout video made primetime news around the country and produced the break investigators needed. A Washington State TV reporter recognized the driver as a white supremacist she had interviewed several years earlier for the TV show Hard Copy. His name was 𝐓𝐴𝐴. Several cops and residents confirmed the identification. Back in Arkansas, Pope County investigators working on the Mueller triple homicide also watched the video. For the first time, they saw 𝐓𝐴𝐴. They assisted Ohio State and federal investigators in the manhunt, since 𝐓𝐴𝐴 was also a suspect in the Arkansas murders. Duvall and Jordan traveled to Ohio to meet with FBI agent Hargraves to share information. They told Hargraves that the killers used a blue General Motors vehicle to transport the victims. Hargrave thought the connection was strong, since the truck abandoned after the shootout was a blue Chevy Suburban, and more of Mueller's property was found inside. The team agreed that if paint scrapings from the Suburban matched the blue paint specks found on the victims, they would have forensic evidence tying 𝐓𝐴𝐴 to the Arkansas crimes. At the FBI lab in Washington, D.C., examiners determined that the paint specks did not match the sample found in Arkansas. FBI agent Jim Shenandoah was called in, a specialist in tracking domestic terrorists like 𝐓𝐴𝐴.
We found out that they had engaged in militia-type activities, that they had anti-government views. They were very anti-law enforcement at the time. So it really heightened the security in terms of what these suspects were going to do next.
Seeking more information on 𝐓𝐴𝐴, a Washington State trooper interviewed his father, Kirby, at his home in Colesville. The trooper asked him if he recognized the men in the video. Kirby did not identify his son 𝐓𝐴𝐴, but he said the second man was his younger son, Shane.
We found this unusual because the video made it fairly easily to identify the driver, who was 𝐓𝐴𝐴, but not quite as easy to identify Shane. We thought that perhaps there might have been some favoritism for one son over the other.
The FBI looked into the background of 23-year-old 𝐓𝐴𝐴 and 21-year-old Shane 𝐘𝐲.
𝐓𝐴𝐴 was linked to a variety of crimes. In addition to the 3 murders in Arkansas, he was linked to a murder in Washington State and a murder in, we believe, in Idaho. He also committed a series of burglaries, robberies, and extortions, and also interstate transportation of stolen property.
APBs were issued for the 𝐘𝐲 brothers. On February 18th, investigators picked up the Kehoe's trail in Frankfort, Ohio, 45 miles from the shootout site in Wilmington. A Chevy Monte Carlo was found abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. It had been reported stolen a mile from where the shootout occurred. Authorities suspected that at least one of the Kehoes had stolen it to escape the manhunt. The keys were all the robber had left. Investigators feared the desperate brothers would stop at nothing to escape custody. State police fanned out to canvass the area, hoping someone may have seen one of the fugitives. A mile away at the Lake Hill campground, the Kehoe's path reemerged. Investigators learned that the pair had camped there with their families in an RV, but authorities arrived too late. Just 2 days earlier, the motorhome had pulled out. No one knew if the brothers were on board. The FBI released a nationwide APB for the vehicle. As the weeks passed, people reported sightings of the RV. They had also seen women and children in the camper. Each time authorities responded, the camper was gone. The Kehoe's trail heated up again 150 miles away in Indianapolis, Indiana, where another stolen vehicle was recovered. Inside, investigators found clothing and a gas receipt signed by Chevy Kehoe, but no trace of his brother Shane. The van had been stolen 13 miles from where Chevy fled the blue Suburban after firing on Ohio officers. The Kehoes were still one step ahead. The trail of plundered cars signaled that the Kehoe's crime spree would not cease until authorities stopped them.
There it is. We felt early on that if confronted again by law enforcement, that there would be a great probability that there would be another shooting involved and that innocent people would be hurt.
Across the country, local and federal investigators were put on high alert. They needed to find the Kehoe brothers before they struck again. In Arizona, a state trooper came upon an RV that fit the description of the Kehoe's camper. It had no license plates, and its shades were drawn. He called in reinforcements. He knew the brothers were armed and dangerous and would shoot to kill. Within moments, a SWAT team surrounded the RV. They hoped the nighttime assault would catch the Kehoes off guard and lessen the chances of another armed confrontation. An Arizona SWAT team was on the move to catch the Kehoe brothers, armed fugitives wanted in 2 states for murder and attempted murder.
Freeze!
They thought they had them cornered. It was the wrong RV. Several days later, a Wyoming highway patrolman found the Kehoe's mobile home broken down and abandoned on a desolate stretch of road. The FBI was informed and asked that the RV be towed into town for inspection. The Wyoming State Police obtained a warrant and documented its contents. This vehicle, like the Suburban, held a large cache of ammunition, guns, several fake FBI jackets, and U.S. Marshals badges. One discovery stopped the officers in their tracks.
Hey, come take a look at this.
A box of explosive components, including batteries used to detonate bombs. Fearing a booby trap, the troopers called in the ATF bomb squad. Nearby business and government offices were evacuated. Inch by inch, the bomb squad probed the RV. The thorough investigation revealed no live devices. But the danger wasn't over. According to ATF agent Jordan, the 𝐘𝐲 brothers had a well-equipped bomb factory, which increased their potential for violence.
The bomb-making components that we found consisted of some metal cylinders, several types of chemicals, mixing bowls, hot plate coffee filters, instructions for making homemade blasting caps, quite an assortment of bomb-making components.
Receipts on board revealed the family's path since leaving Ohio. They traveled through West Virginia, North Carolina, Alabama, Texas, and Montana before ditching the mobile home in Wyoming. The vehicle offered few clues to the 𝐘𝐲's current location.
All we knew was that Chevy was last known to be in Indianapolis, where the stolen van was recovered. We presumed that Shane and the families had made it as far as Casper, where the camper had broken down. From that point on, we basically had a cold trail.
To entice the public's help, the FBI and ATF announced that they had joined to offer a reward for the pair's arrest and conviction.
The fact that it was a serious matter involving law enforcement, the fact that they had some affiliation to supremacy groups, and the fact that they were dangerous individuals, we were able to obtain a $60,000 reward for their apprehension.
More than 100 tips came in. The local leads were handled by the Ohio State Police, while the FBI and ATF pursued those from out of state. On June 16th, investigators got the news they were hoping for. A sheriff in Stevens County, Washington, received a call from a friend of Shane 𝐘𝐲. Shane wanted to turn himself in. The 21-year-old surrendered to the authorities and informed them where he and his brother had been for the last few months. After the Wilmington shootout, Shane had stolen a car and returned to the campground. There he gathered his and his brother's families and drove to Wyoming, where he met Chevy. Soon after the 𝐘𝐲s were reunited, the RV broke down. Chevy told investigators that he and his brother had finally found refuge with their families on a remote ranch in rural southern Utah. A farmer and his wife had taken them in and offered them room and board in exchange for doing work on the ranch. Soon the situation began to deteriorate. Chevy couldn't control his explosive temper. Both Shane and his wife, Tana, grew concerned. Chevy talked of building his own white supremacist order. He thought of killing his wife, Karina, because of Native American ancestry in her family. He even talked of murdering his own parents, Kirby and Gloria, in order to raise his 6 younger brothers with his beliefs. On June 12th, almost 4 months after the shootouts in Ohio, Chevy finally turned his growing paranoia on his own brother.
Shane explained to us that they had recently gotten into a fight and that he feared for his life as well as the lives of his family.
Shane also told investigators that Chevy had several items in his possession that belonged to the Muellers. Chevy had also admitted to suffocating the Mueller family. Not knowing what Chevy would do next, Shane and his family fled Utah in the middle of the night, driving almost 1,000 miles back to Washington State. Authorities inspected the truck Shane drove, looking for additional evidence. Lab examiners discovered that the vehicle, which belonged to 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲, had been repainted from its original blue color. FBI forensic chemist Ron Mentold explains.
We often see repainted vehicles in the laboratory here, and we can determine how it was originally painted. The layers of paint can many times be thought of as a stack of cards that is loosely adhered to each other. Okay, and any one card can be withdrawn from the layer and sampled individually. So the ace of diamonds, which is a primer layer, would be different in chemistry and color from the king of spades, which would be on top.
The test results were conclusive. The composition of the blue paint found on the 𝐞𝐲's vehicle matched the specs found on the Mueller's bodies. The evidence against 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲 was compelling, but capturing him would be no easy task. Investigators would have to travel to 𝐲𝐴's remote hideout in Utah, where an arrest team could be seen approaching from miles away.
If you could slap one character for their dumb decisions, who would it be? Huh? Go on. Vent in the comments. I can't wait to read.
Wanted for triple homicide in Arkansas and attempted murder in Ohio, the white supremacist 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲 was heavily armed and hiding with his family on an isolated ranch. Apprehending the criminal in the wide open spaces of southern Utah would be dangerous for agents and 𝐲𝐴's family. The FBI and ATF needed an arrest plan that minimized the risk. Agent Will Long was in charge of coordinating the plan. He is in shadow in order to protect the sensitive nature of his current case.
𝐲𝐴's children and his wife were there, and we certainly didn't want to get involved in a situation where they were in the middle of a shooting situation or possible hostage situation.
Long enlisted the help of Rodney Levitt, the farmer on whose land the brothers had been living. Levitt agreed to help the FBI due to his concern for 𝐲𝐴's children.
He told us that on a regular basis, 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲 would, at his request, travel into Cedar City to run errands for him related to the farming operation. And in this case, they had previously talked about 𝐲𝐴 coming into town on this day to pick up some feed from the local feed store. And we decided that we could use that as an opportunity to take him at the feed store in an environment that we could control.
That left agents only 2 hours to get into position before 𝐲𝐴 arrived in town with Levitt.
2 hours is a short amount of time. We placed surveillance units along the road that would be in a position to call out the location of 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲 and Mr. Levitt as they made their way into town.
The plan was working perfectly until 𝐲𝐴 𝐞𝐲 made an unscheduled stop. The FBI didn't know if 𝐞𝐲 was on to them and was making a run for it. The agent on location radioed in for assistance. He waited for instructions to apprehend 𝐞𝐲 or get Levitt to safety. For a few breathless moments, no one knew what would happen next. 𝐲𝐴 returned to the truck with a soda. To the undercover agent, it seemed that 𝐲𝐴 had no suspicions and returned to the road. Back in town, more than 25 agents waited for the arrival of 𝐲𝐴 and Levitt. Snipers were positioned on the rooftops, and the feed store was surrounded. Agents were also located in the nearby neighborhood. Their objective was to prevent 𝐲𝐴 from escaping and taking hostages. While Agent Long loaded hay in front of the feed store, his plan nearly went awry.
As we were listening to the radio, we heard one of the surveillance units call out that 𝐲𝐴 had crossed a landmark that was approximately 1 minute away from the feed store.
At that very moment, the farmer unwittingly pulled into the parking spot the FBI was holding for 𝐲𝐴. Agent Long had a split second to act.
Sir,
I ran across the parking lot with my badge and credentials in my hand. I told this man that a dangerous fugitive was about to pull into the parking lot and that we were going to arrest him right here, and that he needed to immediately get in his vehicle and get out of the parking lot.
The farmer complied, and Long returned to his position. Seconds later, Chevy Kehoe pulled into the parking lot.
FBI, get on the ground! Get down on the ground! Get down on the ground!
Long and his team pounced on the suspected murderer, leaving him no time to reach for a concealed weapon. After 5 months of a nationwide manhunt, the FBI had finally captured Chevy Kehoe. Back at the ranch, there was still the matter of taking Chevy's wife, Karina, and their 3 kids into custody. Once again, 𝐓𝐡𝐞 offered his help.
Apparently, Mr. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 had an injured back, and Karina would routinely come out and open the gate for Mr. 𝐓𝐶𝐶 to let him into the property as a courtesy to him because of his injury.
To open the gate, Karina had to leave the house, giving agents the opportunity to arrest her. Long hid in the back of the truck with 2 other agents.
Just as we anticipated, Karina came out and opened the gate, and as she was looking at the gate and concentrating on manipulating the latch, we jumped out of the back of the truck and immediately searched her and found a loaded 9mm pistol in her back pocket.
Get out on the ground, ma'am. Get out on the ground. Get out on the ground. Spread your legs. Spread your arms.
Long obtained a search warrant for the Kehoe's trailer on the 𝐓𝐶𝐞 property.
Okay.
Before inspecting it, the FBI safely escorted the children outside and entrusted them to the farmer. Back inside, Long discovered a well-stocked armory. Chevy Kehoe, anticipating a siege, had stationed loaded guns at every window. With both brothers finally in custody, the pair was transported back east to face 16 state and local charges. Chevy would first be tried in Arkansas on federal charges. With the Kehoes locked up, U.S. Attorney Paula Casey had several months to prepare a solid case.
The federal agents in Aaron Duvall, Jay Winters, came here and they laid out the evidence they had of all the various crimes that had been committed. And after we examined everything that was there was sort of this growing realization as we reviewed these things that it was a racketeering case.
Placing Chevy's illegal activities under a racketeering umbrella, Casey needed to demonstrate that crimes were committed in order to expand his white supremacist movement.
The racketeering statute lets us give a jury the complete picture of what happened. It lets us put that together so that all of the evidence can be placed before the jury for their decision.
Chevy Kehoe was ultimately charged with 57 federal crimes, including the brutal murder of Bill and Nancy and their 8-year-old daughter, Sarah.
Chevy Kehoe was tried, and following a 3-month jury trial, he was found guilty of racketeering, and as a result of his conviction, he received a sentence of life without the possibility of parole, because in the federal system there is no parole.
As for brother Shane, despite his claims of self-defense, he was found guilty of the state charges brought against him. Among them, attempted murder for the shootout in Wilmington. He is currently serving 24.5 years.
The reason I think every agency was so cooperative in working on this was just that it was a horrible crime. It was a crime that was obviously hard for anybody to figure out why it happened, exactly how it would happen. It was just one of those things that everybody wanted to help out, and they knew that we couldn't do it all ourselves, and if it had been their case, they wouldn't have been able to do it by themselves either. So it was just a matter of everybody getting together, because the bottom line was there were some bad people out there, and everybody just needed to get involved for a common cause, and that was to put the bad guy behind bars.
Be honest. Did you watch the last scene through your fingers? Comment yes or no.